Ivy and Gecko acknowledges the traditional owners of country throughout Australia, and we pay our respects to elders past, present and future. Welcome to Hearts and Minds. Our podcast episodes feature conversations with highly accomplished mining executives and board directors. We'll explore critical themes relating to leadership impact, staff engagement and culture development. So tune in, enjoy the conversations and prepare to be inspired. I'm Alana Bray-White, the Managing Director of Ivy and Gecko, and this is our podcast, Hearts and Minds.
I worry and I lament that, as generations come through, they appear to be more risk averse, and you can't achieve great things by being risk averse.
No.
The chair is an air traffic controller. You're clear for takeoff, you're going to fly around, you're going to take off and follow that flight path. Yeah. And you're going to iterate with me. We're in this together. I'm there to help you. You've got a job, I've got a job. And so I think it is about enabling people to bring out the best in themselves.
Our guest today is John Poynton. John has decades of advisory and capital markets experience across equity, debt, infrastructure and property. In parallel with his career as an investment banker, he has been an active non-executive director of ASX-listed companies, government, education bodies and non-for-profit organisations. He has also maintained a keen interest in the resources sector. John's current roles include co-founder and chair of independent corporate advisory firm Poynton Stavrianou, the non-executive chair of Strike Energy and the non-executive director of Perth Airport. In 2006, John was the recipient of Western Australian Citizen of the Year Award in the Industry and Commerce category, and in 2016, he was appointed as an officer in the General Division of the Order of Australia. We're excited to share this broad-ranging conversation with one of Australia's best-known businessmen and company directors. John shares his views on leadership, culture development, the state of Australia's energy policy, the madness of international politics, Elon Musk, and the threat of humanoid robots. Along the way, he delves into the art of managing boardroom dynamics, he discusses the importance of managing stakeholder expectations, and he reveals how to strengthen your character through failure. Oh, and by the way, next time you hear a whir of a helicopter, look up and give it a wave. It might be John going for a joyride.
John, thanks for joining us in the studio today.
Pleasure, David. Good to see you.
Good on you. Last time we met, I'm pretty sure it was at the WA Mining Club lunch.
Yes, John O. Fisher.
That's right. And I introduced myself and somewhat audaciously said to you, are you willing to come on our podcast? And you didn't hesitate in saying yes. So we really appreciate spending some time in the studio with us. As I've explained, John, the purpose of this podcast, Hearts and Minds, is to learn from high-profile company directors and executives from the resources sector, mainly from the mining companies, and ask them to share some of their experiences and insights on leadership and the impact that has on the engagement of stakeholders and the development of workplace culture. We're interested in those things because as a company we're organisational consultants and we're hopeful that our listeners and our viewers of this podcast might take away some learnings and perhaps modify their thinking and their behaviour to become more influential in their relationships at work. So let's see how we go. Now, you're a well-known business identity in Australia and WA particularly, and you've been recognised at the state and Commonwealth levels for your civic contributions. But people will probably be less familiar with your backstory. So what can you tell us about your early years?
Well, I was born in Melbourne. That was an accident of history. My father was a stockbroker and he actually had a career opportunity in Victoria, which he took not long after he got married. So my sister and I were born there. But then he came back here in the early mid-50s it was, and I was just very young, but very old now, but very young then. And he then started his own firm at a young age. He was in his 30s, just. And so that was, obviously I was too young to know any of that, but it was quite interesting looking in hindsight because he was quite conservative. And I've always taken the view that was a pretty gutsy call to do that.
Yeah.
Particularly back then when that profession was very conservative, very hard to get into, very closed shop and all of that. So starting a new firm in your 30s, late 20s, early 30s would have been, pretty bold.
Yeah, courageous.
So I went to school in Western Australia in Perth and then went to uni. I was never much of a student, and I've often referred to that because we know plenty of people who are very successful students and then go on to do all sorts of great things in universities. And, I've hooked up with some people from Harvard subsequently, but I was never much of a student. And it led me to think that, you can achieve a fair bit without having necessarily substantial academic qualifications. It's much harder now, but it was much easier then.
Dead right. If you look at the history of Australia's most successful entrepreneurs and business people, a fair chunk of them do not have tertiary qualifications. And the old saying goes something like, if those who can do, those who can't study or teach. Not quite true,
That's
but
probably a bit. But I think the point about it is that you don't necessarily need to fret if you are not a fantastic student.
Yeah.
Sure, these days it's hard to get in the door if you don't have some qualifications, but it's not the be all and end all. And that sort of was the case for me. I'd ended up getting a degree, but it wasn't much of a. I refer to it occasionally as a Spanish or a Mexican degree, CC. I wasn't very good, but anyway.
What was your dad's stockbroking firm called?
Hartley Poynton.
Okay.
Which morphed into Hartley's, which is now Euros Hartley. So still going, sort of 70 years later.
Yeah, the family legacy continues.
Yeah.
And so born in Melbourne, schooled in Perth. Who were your early influences, perhaps outside of your immediate family?
Well, it's interesting. I had I still have a cousin, an older cousin, who was very much into aviation. I mean, he was into cars, motorcycles and aviation.
Yep.
And so I guess he was a bit of an influence in that sense. So I learnt to fly when I was 17 and still have a licence.
Gee. Do you get up in the air much these days?
So I have a fixed-wing pilot licence, and a rotary wing, so I fly helicopters.
Wow.
Too. Yeah.
Wow.
So that was, I really, was influenced by him. He had a fantastic sort of his late teenage, early 20s. He was out and about doing lots of things. So he was an influence for sure.
And was there an event or a realisation at some point in your earlier years, John, where you worked out what you wanted to do and your place in the world?
Well, again, my father, who was quite conservative, sat me down when I was 15, I think it was, and was always very keen not to give advice unless it was asked for. And so we sort of had this iterative conversation. And he pretty much said, well, what do you think you want to do? And I said, well, I'm not sure, actually, at that age. And I said, but I've watched what you do, and that looks interesting. To which he then responded, well, if you want to do that, you need to do this, 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 and this. And back in those days, some of the things he said were actually quite prescient, another of my favourite words, because he said, you're going to need to study commerce, you're going to need to study geology, Japanese, because that was our major trading party. You need to go and work in the UK.
Yep.
You're going to need a pilot licence to get around the mining centres of Perth or Western Australia. And that was kind of like, So then I headed down the path and ticked off a few.
Do you speak Japanese?
No. I did try and learn.
There's still time.
There is still time, but I did a few other things. But it was just interesting. I mean, even things like go and work in the UK because that's where our capital's coming from and that.
Yes.
So that was always, looking into the future and sort of getting your skills and your experience ready for what's coming.
Yeah.
What is now, but also what's coming is also an impression I formed that I've carried with me. So that really led me into going to university and then working in London and and then coming back and working. I was going to work in his firm when I got back from the UK, but the markets were appalling, so I worked on the farm for a while, and then I worked in the public service for a while, which was also interesting.
What did you do in the public service, John?
I was a complaints officer in the Department of Consumer Affairs.
You must have got a lot of complaints.
I got a lot of complaints, yes. I could tell you some stories, fascinating. And then I was an industrial inspector in the Department of Labour, which is also associated with Consumer Affairs.
Yeah.
And that was interesting too, because there were situations where people were literally, they weren't in a union, but they were being, really exploited by their employers. And I guess, coming from a pretty privileged background, I thought that's interesting, and it sort of stirred up some, social conscience in me for sure. And then there was an opening in the firm. I joined that, and then over time became a partner, a director, and then the CEO at a relatively early age. And again, that was something where my father had partners. He was easing himself out of the firm, but the partners I had were, 10 to 15 years older than me. So I saw this brash young man kicking and scratching to get the CEO role, and they gave it to me.
That would have been an interesting dynamic, and you and I have a little bit in common in the sense that I was second generation in our family recruitment and executive search business, like you at a relatively young age at a fairly senior level. How did you manage that sort of dynamic where you might have been seen as the
nepotism?
Yes.
Yeah, well, I mean, that was the good thing was that my father was not part of the decision to have me appointed as CEO.
Okay. Yep.
He kind of semi-retired by then, so that was very much in the hands of his partners then. And I've always said it was a pretty brave call. Because I was mid-30s. We walked straight into the 1987 crash. And in a way it was good because I'd never seen anything like that before, and born optimist that I will be fine, in my sort of naivety. And we were, as it turned out. But I've always admired and respected my father's partners for giving me that chance, and I've always tried to back young people as a result.
Yeah.
To sort of assess who you're dealing with and then give them an opportunity, because it worked for me.
Yeah. What do you do when you're not working, John? How do you relax and recharge the batteries?
So I still fly a lot, mostly helicopters, but I did get a command instrument rating, and I was flying around in a little business jet for a while, so that was fun. I keep fit, so I try and train every day, and I've got a gym at home, and exercise is really important to me. And I've now got quite a few grandkids, and so whilst I wouldn't particularly say I was a clucky grandfather, I do like to hang out with them, the grandkids. And my wife's very active. She's chair of Tourism WA and chair of WAPA, and has a pretty active role. So we're out and about a lot. We travel nationally, internationally, and we're out and about, pretty much every night.
Yeah.
So never a dull moment.
Yeah, very active. Good on you. Now, let's talk a little bit about leadership effectiveness, John. Everyone's got a different definition. What does leadership mean to you?
Well, I think it's, in a sense, defining an achievable goal and taking people on that path to actually get there, to achieve the goal, which involves all sorts of things, defining a credible task or vision, if you like, and then having the right resources around you, human and financial, and infrastructure, logistics, whatever, to achieve it. And then, empowering people to achieve it. I always think you can't really be a good leader unless you've followed. They talk about these almost made-up words, followership. I think you have to have worked inside a team being led by somebody else on more than one occasion, on multiple occasions, to see different leadership styles. Because some people are autocratic, some people are very collaborative.
Yes.
Some people have charisma, some people don't, but they still can achieve quite a lot as a leader. And so I think you need to observe other people's styles. I think you need to understand yourself, and then you need to understand the way you can empower people to get to where you want to take them, or where you think you want to go. So it's a pretty nebulous thing. I mean, it's like so much, you can't really define it easily. You can't really put your finger on it, but when it's not there.
Yeah. Yeah, that's very true. And you raise a very good point about different styles of leadership and different personal qualities and traits. I've seen some pretty reserved, introverted individuals who have earned a lot of respect from their people, and who are very authentic in articulating a vision and a common purpose for people to strive towards. So you don't necessarily need to be a song and dance man, do you? I think charisma to some extent is a little bit overrated in leadership.
I think that's a very good word, authentic.
Yes.
I think people have very good BS detectors, and you can usually tell when someone's authentic, when they're doing things for the right reason, the greater good versus self-interest. And as you say, you don't have to be a song and dance, highly charismatic person to do that. I mean, you need to be an effective communicator. And you need to be, as you say, authentic and real. But there's so many, as you say, different styles of leadership and different applied, examples of it. I think that, you can't really say one size fits all.
When we look at leadership styles, is there still a place for the control and command style, or is that history and everybody should be an empower and entrust leader?
It's funny because people do generally, and I say this in the broader sense, want to be led. And sometimes, I suppose it's in a way you can fool all of the people some of the time, some of the people all of the time. And so sometimes that command control, my way or the highway, can be effective for a while.
Yeah.
It heightens the requirement for that leader with that style to actually achieve and continue to get results, because you can work out pretty quickly if it's not happening.
Yeah.
Whereas, if you're much more inclusive and collaborative, everyone owns the outcome.
Yeah.
Whereas, a command control dictator pretty much owns it themselves.
Yeah, that's very true. And I often think that in order to encourage innovation within a business, you do need to allow people to take risks. Calculated risks, and as a consequence of that, they will fail, they'll make mistakes. The key, of course, is to learn from those mistakes. So empowerment, in my experience, is certainly a really good approach to encourage innovation and diversity within a business. To what extent are leadership qualities innate, and to what extent can they be developed in people?
I think again, there's no hard and fast rule, but it feels to me, with my experience, that there's a bit of both. I think you need to you need to understand yourself, and people tend to peel off into leaders and followers, pretty early on. And then it's how you develop the leadership traits to be the most effective leader you can be. And you mentioned risk and risk tolerance. I think it's really important, and I think I worry and I lament that as generations come through, they appear to be more risk averse, and you can't achieve great things by being risk averse.
No.
But then, okay, so are you then singled out if you fail and pilloried and, treated badly for having had a fair crack, and then that stops you ever wanting to do it again. So I think we all have to own, risk tolerance and fast failure and dust yourself off and have another go, because otherwise, people do get depressed about, that failure, that one failure, and then perhaps we've lost who could have been a really good leader second time round. So it's very important. But so, answering the question, I think innate and learnt, definitely, in varying proportions.
Yeah, I'd agree with that as well. I think most people, to some extent, can develop the skills of leadership, irrespective of their position, title, or rank in the hierarchy of an organisation. And often the more inspiring people can be seen in high-vis vests, on a mine site, for example, or in a back office scenario in a more commercial business. And as John Wellborn said to me in a previous podcast, John being an ex-Wallaby, he made the point that when you look at a list of rugby players on a sheet of paper, the leaders don't necessarily have a C in brackets after their name. everybody's got a role to play and to contribute towards the team coming together and winning the game.
And it's fair to say too that, we tend to think of leadership being at the pinnacle, at the top of a hierarchy, but there are individual leaders or people with leadership traits and characteristics inside teams who, for all sorts of reasons, don't want to aspire to the top one or two jobs. But they're very important cogs in the wheel, and they do empower their team around them. And I think it's taking those people on that journey as well is really important.
When we talk about leadership, John, I think most people assume leadership at the executive level. Now, I'm interested in your take on this because you're a very experienced board director and chairman of boards. As a chairman, how do you manage your board dynamic? Presumably the directors on your team are intelligent individuals. They probably have strong convictions on a range of topics. How do you encourage the best from each individual so that they can optimise their contribution to the team effort? How do you manage egos as well?
Well, I think there is a very sort of wide divergence in terms of experience and qualifications for people on boards. And you see it most, I guess, in not-for-profits where a lot of people start.
Yes.
And, not-for-profit land can be a great place to learn the skills of being a non-exec, but there's no reason why you can't or shouldn't aspire to the highest quality and standards, governance standards, in a not-for-profit, and there's still a way to go there. So when it comes to then commercial enterprises, for-profits, government boards and things I've been on, I think firstly that everyone needs to understand why they're there and what their obligations and fiduciary duties are. And there remains a tendency for some people, depending on how they got on the board, to believe that they represent a narrow secular interest. As distinct from, the representation of all the shareholders and the greater good for the company. So that you still see that people, have a view, well, I'm representing X, Y, Z. And therefore that judgment around what the greater good for the company is clouded by the fact, well, maybe it's not so good for my appointor. So that's the first thing, everyone understanding why they're there. The chair is an air traffic controller.
That's an interesting analogy.
You're clear for takeoff. You're going to fly around. You're going to take off and follow that flight path. And you're going to iterate with me. We're in this together. I'm there to help you. You've got a job. I've got a job. And so I think it is about enabling people to bring out the best in themselves and the skills they bring to the board. And that's why divergence or diversity, shall we say, is so important, because everyone is supposed to then bring different things, different experiences and qualifications. So it's bringing out the best. And ultimately, the main word is respect. Everybody around a board table needs to respect each other and their individual sort of abilities. And so everyone needs to respect the chair, but equally the chair isn't a command and control. He's not the captain. He's there to bring the best out in people, she. And just draw people out. Because as you say, some people, are less charismatic, they're more introverted, but they still have some really interesting things to contribute.
Very true. And
so it is about bringing, with mutual respect, the best out in people. And giving them a voice. Some people, of course, are inclined to overuse their voice, and so you need to be firm but fair as well. It
really is. It must be a balancing act being a chairman. It's clearly a very responsible position, and you need to be a psychologist. That's one of the hats that you need to wear.
Well, I think too, the other thing is the relationship between the chair and the CEO is the most important one. And that is as much a mentoring role as it is anything else. You're trying to get the best out of the CEO, trying to avoid them making mistakes that you might see that they might not, because it's there's difference in experience. But that is, it doesn't necessarily matter if the CEO is the MD, because he's a director as well, but he's certainly going to be attending board meetings. And so how that CEO then relates to the rest of the board is, in a sense, the responsibility of the chair.
John, do you encourage your non-executive directors to liaise directly with the C-suite executives, or would you prefer them to go through you as the conduit?
I don't. It's interesting. I could tell an anecdote, but it'll be a bit close to home, so I won't. But I have been in a situation where I've been discouraged from having direct communication. This is some time ago. And my response to that is I cannot carry out my fiduciary duties without having a clear understanding of what's going on inside the organisation. And whilst I don't want to run the business and I don't want to second guess the C-suite people, I need to have a relationship with them. And I need to understand how they're feeling about everything. And that isn't to undermine the authority of the CEO in any way. But I definitely need that, and I strongly encourage all my directors to do that. Because, and by the way, the C-suite likes it because they do then have a direct link to people with different experiences and they feel valued. As distinct from, well, I'm kind of constrained here because the only interaction I'm going to have is through the CEO. And that's sort of maybe not giving me the growth and development I need. So
you mentioned diversity a little while ago, John. Diversity comes in all shapes and sizes. If we think about gender diversity, though, we see big strides of progress have been made in recent years in terms of more females on boards. To a lesser extent, females at the top ranks of the executive. What's the problem? What's the barrier there, John? It seems as though the progress is very, very slow in terms of, especially in the resources sector, of females at the top level of executive.
Yeah, because there are other professions and other industries which seem to attract, a significant number of females, whether it's at an exec or non-exec level. And I'm thinking the law, I'm thinking things like veterinary science. There are places where, women are well and truly overrepresented in that sense.
Yeah.
A lot of the time it's self-confidence. A lot of the time it's logistics, family, those sort of things. And unfortunately, females obviously, particularly if they've taken a more traditional route and had kids, have got this gap in their career, which, is probably unfair, but what do we do about it? Where they don't have the continuous engagement with other peers, non-execs, whatever. And so they tend, and you see it quite often, to come to non-exec land fairly late.
Yes.
They don't necessarily bring that continuity with them, and so therefore, whilst on the one hand you've got the benefit of gender diversity and gender, you don't then have necessarily the full suite of experience qualification. So it's hard. So you do need, as a chair, to be aware of that and encourage as much as you can those people coming in. And I'm not a kind of quota person, I'm not a tokenist at all. My experience of having females on the board has been fantastic. And I remember saying to some people many years ago when I was on the board of EFIC, the Export Finance and Insurance Corporation, there was a female who then went on to be probably one of the best non-exec directors, chair of all sorts of, major enterprises, who was the smartest person I've ever met in a room. And the pin would, the room would go silent. She said, Mr. Chair, I'd just like to refer to page 46, item 6A4, and where it says it, and everyone's going, what's going to come? She was amazing.
Wow.
And so, there should not be any issue about, smarts.
Yeah.
Because there are plenty of females smarter than a whole lot of blokes.
Yeah.
And so I do lament the fact that it's taken so long. There's no justifiable reason other than, as I said, perhaps just, needing to raise children is a problem. And in mining, I don't know, maybe it's a lifestyle thing, as well.
Yeah.
But, we need to do what we can.
And now we take a short break to acknowledge our sponsors.
This episode is brought to you by Halo Civil Engineering. Halo is a multidiscipline civil contractor that specialises in the delivery of complex civil projects across defence, infrastructure, energy and resources. A West Australian company committed to delivering dynamic solutions with a focus on zero harm, while having a positive impact on their industry, clients and the people they serve. For more information, Search for Halo Civil Engineering on socials or visit halocivil.com. If you'd like to inquire about sponsoring an episode of Hearts and Minds, please reach out to us on LinkedIn or via email info@ivyandgecko.com.au. Ivy & Gecko is a leading Australian talent and organisational consulting firm. We specialise in providing executive search and board consulting services to ASX small and mid-tier explorers, developers and producers in the gold and critical minerals industries. As the only executive search and leadership consulting firm to be admitted membership of the Minerals Council of Australia, Ivy & Gecko is uniquely resourced to advocate for the interests of our exploration, project development and mining clients.
I often think that inclusion should come before diversity. There's no point having a diverse board or a diverse executive team if the individuals in that team are not included, if they don't feel a strong sense of belonging and safety within the team. I think some people perhaps place too much emphasis on diversity and not enough in taking proactive actions to improve inclusion. What do you think?
You're amongst many other things a recruiter. It's interesting because people will often say that a female who's easily as good as her male peers will be the last person to ask for a pay rise. And I'm a bit off topic, but it's a bit the same. You know, sometimes you talk to your peers, your female peers on a board, and you get the sense that they, you know, are almost surprised that their opinion's been asked for. You know, like, it's almost like a shrinking violet kind of thing. Well, hang on, you know, you're really smart. You're one of the rest of us. We're all equal here.
Is this imposter syndrome?
Probably.
Right.
But or maybe maybe it is a version of imposter syndrome. How did I get here? And you wouldn't want to hear my view. Well, you have to train that out because of course we want to hear your view, and often it's a completely different view that other people hadn't thought of.
Yeah.
But there is this almost, I'm not, you know, kind of shouldn't be here, or and that's a problem. I mean, everyone to a certain degree suffers from imposter syndrome, except for perhaps some high-profile, very charismatic people that, you know, probably should but don't. But so it's up to the chair again to draw those people who might be a little more introvert out.
As a side, John, I often think that revealing your own vulnerabilities is a very good first step to a foundation, really, to building trust with people. If they can decipher that you realise you don't have all the answers, that you have deficiencies, people tend to engage with you more effectively and begin to trust you. Can you share a memorable failure in your career that you've learned from and that as a result has helped you become a better leader?
Yeah, there's a few, probably regrettably, far too many. So there were a couple of high-profile things I got involved with some time ago, and one involved a listed public company where we did an MBO. And whilst I had a bit of experience overseas, and especially in America, these things were fairly normal, but here it was, you know, the worst thing in the world. And so I think probably should have engaged in getting some more advice from people I trusted before I, you know, perhaps went down that path. And it was a very sobering lesson because notwithstanding, you know, our view we hadn't done anything wrong or we were actually motivated by trying to create value, that wasn't a view of a whole lot of other people. And, you know, so we lost the PR battle. Another time I was taking a firm down a path of growth, substantial and very dramatic growth compared with what it had been doing. And I didn't take my then fellow shareholders on that path, and they panicked. You know, they this isn't what we've signed on for, and we don't want to do that. So I left that firm. And so I think there are times when you learn that you do, you know, it isn't my way or the highway. You actually do need to get advice from people you trust. You need to engage collaboratively, inclusively with the people around you. And if you don't, you're going to wear some consequences.
And those skills in collaboration and that trait of empathy that needs to be developed over time so that you genuinely do understand the other person's point of view. These are qualities, John, which a lot of people find hard to come to grips with. Very often I see senior executives who have a technical grounding. They're, might be a mining engineer or a geologist who over the course of 20 or 30 years has risen the ranks to be running a business or a unit of a business. And empathy is a skill that does not come naturally to them, and they struggle with it. Is there, for people in that category, how do we go about cultivating those very, very important skills of relating to other people?
Yeah. Well, you sent me some notes just to be pondering about what we might talk about and, the kind of traits you're looking for. And I think, fundamentally, if you're looking for a well-rounded person, you want IQ, EQ, trust and loyalty and probably honesty.
Yep.
And, so of all of those things, the one that's probably in, short supply quite often or occasionally anyway is EQ.
Yes.
So this self-awareness, right?
Yes.
How am I coming across to the counterparties I'm dealing with? And I see it a lot in communication, whether it's written or verbal. The people who don't put their head in the head of the recipient of the communication, whether it's written or verbal, what am I trying to tell David? And how's he going to view what I'm telling him?
Yes.
And the number of people that don't do that is actually extraordinary.
Yeah.
And so I think it's the same. I'm a leader and I'm relating to these people who report to me and I'm interacting with them. And, let's read the body language. Let's see how they're going to react to what I'm going to say. And if there's if I'm intuitive enough to pick that up, then surely I'm going to modify my behaviour if I want to get the outcome.
Yeah.
But how you train someone to have more EQ, I'm not sure. Maybe a few sobering failures might be the way to do it. I don't know.
Maybe, and perhaps having a buddy mentor, someone who's been there and done it to some extent and who has the patience and the EQ themselves to be able to take someone under their wing over an extended period of time and develop those skills. There's no easy answer, is there? As part of our research for our book that we produced last year, John, we did a lot of research. We identified, I think it was 35 companies. These were ASX listed junior and mid-tier explorers, project developers and producers of gold and other critical minerals. We were interested to survey the CEOs of these organisations and the heads of people and culture, essentially to find out what they thought they were offering that was of value to their staff and senior level candidates. We collected that information. Separately, we interviewed or surveyed over 300 key managers and executive level people in the industry to get their take on it as well. What did they value in a prospective employer? Our hypothesis was that we'd see some degree of misalignment between what the employers thought they were offering and what the staff thought they were receiving. And there were. Does this resonate with you? What's your point of view in terms of the employer value proposition that needs to be pitched to a high level executive candidate?
I think it comes back to these traits of leadership and what's the organisation trying to achieve? What's it stand for? What's its sort of ethos? Now, we're probably tending to suggest companies that have existed for a while as distinct from startups, but startups probably reflect more closely the values of their founders than perhaps a longer-term organisation. But I guess I had the chance to observe very early on Michael Chaney's leadership style and against another company that was developing a plan a bit like Wesfarmers as a conglomerate. And the value set of a Chaney versus the CEO or the person motivating this other company were completely different.
Right.
And so Michael very early on said, we want to offer an environment where people are proud to work with us. And we define our values quite clearly. We obviously live the values, and then people will both enjoy working there and tell other people how good it is. That company obviously exploded in value, and it's just been fantastic. We're very lucky to have them, versus the other one, which pretty much disappeared.
Yes.
And it was, for me, a very applied example of how values really were tangible, in the sense if they're not there, it causes a problem. So I think it's it's whether you're starting with an early stage company or one that's been going for a while. And as I mentioned earlier, people have got pretty good BS detectors, so they're going to know. And then we do read, obviously, you know, plenty of companies that supposedly are great employers, and every now and then there's a scandal or whatever. So I think it's everyone at the top very much living, you know, values that make sense to younger people in particular. And not trying to cut corners.
That's right. It's like parenting, isn't it? I mean, it's a matter of modelling the behaviours that you wish to be repeated in the workplace. And you're dead right. Another part of our research, we found that the vast majority of people look for a community-focused purpose of their business and an appropriate values-based culture. And I think too many organisations perhaps emphasise the quality of their physical assets or their financial balance sheet when pitching their value proposition to candidates, and perhaps underemphasise the importance and value of the culture and the values and the integrity of the leadership team.
The interesting thing is there's still no way of measuring the value of a team inside an organisation. And given that companies are only ever, you know, really people, they've got assets that they work with to achieve an outcome, but essentially, you know, it's the people that make the company. And you can't value that on a balance sheet.
No, you can't.
You just know that company's got better people than that company. You know, and sure, some are very asset intensive and capital intensive, but it's just interesting because it is so important. And if you get it wrong, you know, if you don't live the values, or if you're, you know, in a sense, sort of, you know, trying to, you know, convince people of something that they know not to be true, it has an impact on your value. So I think that is a study in itself that you could spend a very long time doing comparatives. But I think that there's enough evidence would say you get the culture right, you deliver a value proposition that outperforms.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, people are the great enabler of business success, and we know that if people are truly engaged in the work that they do, then they tend to apply discretionary effort. In other words, they put in beyond the minimum required. And when that starts to happen to a critical mass, great things can happen. If you get a team of people who are really committed to furthering their work and their business, productivity improves, safety improves, innovation increases, and ultimately the business becomes more profitable. So it's all linked, isn't it? It is,
yeah. And, you know, I mean, obviously you want to deliver a financial outcome to the shareholders, but not at any cost. Because the harder you go in the short term to achieve that, the potential for damage longer term.
Yeah. John, we often hear about a company's culture after a crisis happens. There may have been a moral or a regulatory breach that's initially thought of as a one-off, but then over time we begin to see that it's more systemic than that. Does it take necessarily a crisis to turn people's attention to the culture of a business? And do you have any experience in turning around a toxic culture?
I think that the thing I would say is that you should try and have enough understanding about what's going on internally to avoid there being some kind of, you know, crisis you didn't see coming, right? So that's about, in the case of, say, an energy company, you know, what are the crises going to be, right? The really bad ones are going to kill someone, you know? Okay, so what were the procedures put in place to avoid that happening? And, you know, the idea of encouraging whistleblowers or people who, you know, are at the coalface to feel safe enough to call that out. In a different way, you know, you can have a surprising lack of success in a particular outcome you're going for, which can create a crisis in a market, but isn't a crisis of culture or whatever. So I think that idea of people throughout the organisation, particularly the non-execs, having a fair view about how culture works at the coalface, particularly in areas that can be, you know, existential, if you like, you know, and there is industrial manslaughter legislation. So that's right. In terms of turning around toxic culture, yes, I have had some experience at a school where there was potentially a if you like, inversion of the governance pyramid, so that management kind of figured it, it was at the top, and there was a bit of a lack of respect for the governance that was sitting above.
Yeah.
And so that had been allowed to develop over time, and the only way to fix that was to remove the cause, if you like. And so you have to, again, you need people around you to help do that, but you have to have the fortitude to say, look, this isn't necessarily going to be popular, because not everyone might share the view, but stepping back, having a look, culturally, is this healthy? No, it's not. What do? You have to change people. You have to change people that enabled it to happen in the first place, and you have to change executives that have perhaps lived that.
Yeah. As someone once said to me, if you want to influence people's mindset, you either change the people or change the people. I'm interested in your take, John, on leadership in a M&A context. Being focused on the mid-tier mining industry, I see a lot of consolidation in the industry, companies coming together. The intent, of course, being that the synergy will be there, the whole will be more than the sum of the parts, and that's the purpose of an M&A. But I do see oftentimes companies paying a lot of attention to the integration of the physical assets, the operating mines or the process plants or the infrastructure that goes along with the two companies. They pay less attention, it seems to me, on the less tangible qualities of the integration of the business. I'm talking the people, the culture, the processes. As a consequence of that, it seems to me that the true potential value of the merger is not realised. They're missing out because the process is not complete. Do you have a take on this?
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I think there's so much value destroyed from improper post-merger integration. And even, you talk about work done on DD to work out how the physical assets are going to come together. Quite often people miss doing as much of that as they should as well, because egos take over, the thrill of a deal and, 1-on-1 will equal 10 and all of that. So it's been a lot of value destroyed. I remember when we sold one of our businesses way back, we were, I suppose, pleasantly surprised by the generous nature of the bid and felt some obligation to deliver an outcome to the buyer. We didn't see them for 12 months. They were from another country and they just let us keep doing it. We did, well, hang on, why have you done this? Surely you saw there were synergies and benefits and things. They just didn't bother. So we all left subsequently as soon as our handcuffs were off, which is the opposite, given it was only people they bought.
And what happened to the business then?
Well, it didn't do too well, So it was kind of weird that happened. And so, I think it's hard because a lot of the time these things are very confidential and you don't want things to leak. So how many people in the C-suite do you tell? And then the other side, if you're having a conversation, are you going to scare the horses and people are going to vote with their feet? How do you sell this? You don't have a lot of time.
Yes.
And so I think it's tricky, but you have to take into account when you're looking at the transaction to start with, that very point. How much of that, intellectual property, not physical assets, but the people value are we going to lose?
Yes.
Because if we're going to lose a lot of it and we can't control that, then we've got to change our, our view about value.
Yeah. Indeed.
So you're absolutely right. It's a problem.
Mandatory climate change reporting is on the horizon for companies that fit in the category. As the chair of Strike Energy, John, are you able to outline your board's approach to governance in terms of presenting the regulators and the market with evidence of progress your company is making in reducing carbon emissions?
It's a valid thing, and it's, obviously to a degree, I think got a bit ahead of itself because, you make a pronouncement as a government, you're going to shut down coal, but you don't have a baseload alternative or storage technology's not up to it. Yeah. So, in a sense, the tail wagged the dog a bit there, and I think as we get closer in this state to 2030, the realisation of perhaps the hasty nature of that will become more clear. In the meantime, you both, morally obligated, but also legislatively obligated to do what you can. And so to that extent, one of our fields, we have solar and wind, providing pretty much 100% of the power required. We think that gas is the obvious transition fuel in terms of energy generation, but also it's a feedstock for so many things. Gas isn't going away anytime soon because there's no alternative. So it doesn't help to demonise gas, which has happened a lot in this whole,
it has.
Transition discussion.
Yeah.
We need to take what we've got as assets at the moment, do the best with them as we can to achieve, the renewable future as quickly as we can. And if we're going to damage ourselves economically by going too quickly or misallocating resources, then we're not going to have the capacity to invest in the things that would get us there. It's a circular argument. All we know at Strike is we need to do what we can, and we are doing what we can to reduce our carbon footprint. We need to continue to advocate for gas as that transition fuel, and in fact, not just sort of for peaking, but potentially for baseload. I mean, one of the things we're doing is we've one of our gas fields, which was part of a disappointing suite of sort of exploration outcomes, is now going to be we're going to build a power station right alongside it to put peaking power into the grid, which is lower carbon than perhaps might otherwise be the case. So we're trying to do what we can, but equally I think we have an obligation to convince governments that they don't want to go so quickly we're going to hurt ourselves.
Yeah, that's true. And nuclear energy, John, is back on the table and seems to be becoming increasingly a political football. What's your point of view on the practicalities and the costs associated with Australia building modular nuclear reactors?
Well, I'm very much there. I mean, one of the key things is obviously to avoid additional expenditure in poles and wires infrastructure.
Yes.
So you locate the SMRs or SNRs, where the existing infrastructure is able to take that power, different source. So I'm there. What disappoints me, I suppose, given that you don't see the heat in the public about the argument that you did, 30 years ago, people marching the streets and people have kind of worked it out. Yep. It's a nonsense to throw up some of the arguments that have been thrown up, given how ubiquitous nuclear power is in a whole lot of developed countries.
Yeah.
And so there's a real credibility issue there because it's kind of treating people like fools.
Yes.
Why not have a mature debate, bipartisan debate to determine what the best energy mix is and the time of implementation.
Yeah.
And so all you're going to do is you're going to continue to polarise people unnecessarily.
Yeah, yeah.
But I don't think the, three-eyed fish, argument is getting any traction, and in fact it's probably being quite counterproductive.
Yeah. Some cynics would say, John, that the polarisation of the Australian community, as you describe it, is almost a political aim of our politicians these days. Given the short tenure, a 3-year term, basically you've got a year to do the hard yards and the hard work, and then you're back in campaigning mode to regain control and power. And it seems to me that it's almost disingenuous for the politicians to have a bipartisan, sensible debate and to bring the community along with them.
Yeah, what you said would absolutely have been the view from 22 that we'd have at least 2 terms, 6 years of the current administration.
Yeah.
There's been this incredible erosion of that political capital over time and over a relatively short period of time.
Yes.
And I think part of it has been around polarising people. Across a number of different areas, in politics, in the economy, in the community.
Yeah.
And so, if you look at what's happened here, you had, a long period of coalition government. You got the McGowan government came in. They were conservative fiscally. They were progressive, socially.
Yep. They
kind of played the centre. Obviously, COVID was a bit of an aberration, but you got, a big swing. So that's the second term. Coming up to March the 8th, you're probably going to see third term. And I think there's lessons to be learned about that because, you read the electorate and you say, right, I'm going to continue to deliver fiscal responsibility, social progression. I'm going to continue to invest in infrastructure, and I'm going to treat the electorate with respect. I'm going to tell them what I'm going to do. I'm going to let them, reflect on that and let me know what they think, and then I'm going to implement.
Yeah.
So why wouldn't you do that federally? Why create, a divisive environment, which in a sense all it does is splits people off, and now we've got the potential for an ungovernable country. The current administration is now at 31%. It's hardly representative. And so if you have to form government by cobbling together a whole lot of people with disparate views, in some cases radical views, how's that good for the country? So why not lead with respect?
Yeah.
And I think this is going to be, this period, and as we come into May next year, is going to be really interesting for political historians in the future.
In about 10 days' time, we've got the US election, and it really is a source of entertainment and comedy from my point of view, listening to the Trump versus Harris campaigning. And it is such a divisive, polarising, non-policy entertainment show. And sadly, because of the rules where if you want to vote, you can. If you don't want to, then you don't. We tend to draw extremists from both ends, don't we, to turn up and cast their vote. So
I think what you have to hope is that there's sufficient history in the system that America won't allow anything silly to happen merely because there's one radical or another in the White House.
Yeah, hopefully there's grown-ups in the room.
And even if you look at the markets, which I'm a great respecter of, we had a record a couple of days ago on the Dow after a huge run. The markets are not worried. Maybe some of the leaders of parts of the free world are worried because they don't know what's going to happen if Trump got up. But I think you'd have to have some faith that the broad policy framework of the US stays relatively intact.
You'd hope so.
You'd hope so.
John, this has been an interesting conversation. We've gone from leadership and culture development within businesses to energy policy and politics. Here's a bit of fun time for us. Let's do some rapid fire questions. Are you ready?
Sure.
When you think about people who have shown great leadership, whether it be business, sport, or the creative arts, who do you think of as your number one exemplary leader?
I've had the fortune of spending time with a lot of people, and Peter Costello is a fantastic leader. I mean, somewhat misjudged, I think, in many ways. Michael Chaney, I mentioned earlier. Jamie Dimon in the US, I've had the chance to meet. People like Nikki Haley, I really met her. So there's been a few people like that. Rod Eddington, one of my, when I was at school with him, he was a bit older, but, just some people who really live their values.
Nikki Haley, potential president for 8 years.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, she, you've got to be careful what you wish for. I mean, the Republicans obviously thought, well, we've got Joe on the ropes, and maybe they didn't expect what to happen. But if they put Nikki up, I think it'd be a different ballgame altogether. But there you go.
What is the non-fiction book that you've gained most value from?
Well, it's a long time ago, but again, and I've used the word a couple of times, a prescient book by Samuel P. Huntington called The Clash of Civilizations.
I've heard of it.
I read it in 1998, and it really resonated with me. And I've read, as we all do, lots of non-fiction, but that was the precursor for what we've now got, which is this sort of Islam versus the West.
Okay.
And he called it.
When did he write this book?
1998.
Okay.
Fascinating. Absolutely called it. So that book still, is embodied or, etched in my mind.
What's your favourite productivity hack? In other words, what's one thing that you do probably at the start of every day that sets you up for the rest of your day?
You got me this morning because I didn't do it, but most mornings I'm in the gym.
Yeah.
And I think that I try and do aerobic and some weights and.
You look pretty fit.
Well, I try to be. So I think, that clears your mind. Get up a sweat in the morning, get your head clear, and then that to me makes me more productive.
I'm slightly less energetic, but I have the same philosophy. I go for a walk for probably an hour early every morning, listen to podcasts, just think through my day, visualize what's going to happen, and psychologically I feel better. Physically, I probably haven't done much improvement, but
it's interesting just to reflect. As you get older, the time left is obviously by definition less, and so you tend to focus on quality.
Yes.
And to me, it's pretty simple. You stay fit, you eat properly, sleep well, and try and avoid too much stress.
Yes.
Probably going to give yourself a better chance.
Yeah.
It's just logical.
Yeah, it is. You don't need to see a highfalutin medical professional to work that out. It's a little bit of self-discipline. What have you changed your mind about recently?
Not in a specific sense, but I think in a general sense, it's more about being open to being wrong, to having a view that, someone can convince you is not correct. And again, as you get older, everything just turns grey.
Yeah.
It's not black, it's not white.
Yes.
And you see so many people that take black and white views that then down the track, are forced to a different view. So it isn't so much a specific thing, I got that wrong, it's more, hey, I'm going to keep an open mind on everything because, like you said earlier, no one knows everything.
Yeah, that's right.
And so, I'm always up for being convinced I was wrong on something. And I think that's part of this EQ thing as well, that, and also learning from other people who've got skills you don't, to take you. I mean, it's interesting, some stuff about Elon Musk. And I think it was Dell was saying, one of those guys, saying, how can a journalist from someone, criticise Elon Musk as being an idiot when he just keeps doing what he keeps doing, So, be careful that you don't get into a paradigm view about a person or a thing, which can be patently wrong.
Yes.
Because you're just going to look like a fool.
Yeah, nice. The benefit of experience and wisdom. I often find that talking with chairs or non-executive directors as opposed to executives, directors seem to be a little bit more patient and more generous in affording me time to listen to what I have to say and for me to listen to what they have to say. There's just less stress, less tension in the conversation very often.
I was in a meeting a couple of days ago with someone that came on from the US. It was in a life sciences space, and the person I was with and I just sat there listening to this lecture. And at the end I said, the person who said you've got, 2 ears and 1 mouth, and they should be used proportionately, got it right.
Good advice.
Be a listener. If you're not listening, you're not learning.
Yeah, indeed. John, what activity really excites you?
Getting in the helicopter.
Wow.
Love it, yeah.
When are you next heading up there?
Oh, probably in the next week or so, I've got to go to Sydney. But, try and get into the chopper once a month or so.
Are you going to do a Dick Smith and transverse the country or the world?
I've done a lot of flying in other countries and across Australia, which is fantastic. But as we all know, helicopters have only got limited range. The moment you start trying to fly them over long distances,
Can you refuel them mid-air like aeroplanes? Okay.
I think you can, the military ones. I've got some big longs. You're landing every 3 hours.
Yeah. What do you get really bored with?
Repetition, doing the same things. I just have this terribly short attention span. And so I've got, as I often say, attention span of a gnat. So, I tend to be able to focus on things, quite intensely for a short period. Yeah. But if you ask me to read something that's repetitious or is boring or a task that's boring, I'm just not your man. Is
it fair to say that as you've got older, your attention span decreases? I presume as a young man you were able to concentrate for longer.
Yeah. I don't know what, it's just innate.
But it's the quality, not the quantity.
Well, yeah, exactly. John. And it can be frustrating because, you should be able to, focus on things. So it's not me.
Last question, John. If you walked out of this recording studio into the world of 2054, 30 years from now, what would strike you as being the most significant difference in the way that people conducted their lives?
I think none of us is truly aware of the impact of humanoid AI-enabled robots. We're just starting to see what can happen. And so at the moment, AI sits inside a device.
Yeah.
It sits inside software in a car or whatever it is. But what is coming are things that look like us, that have the dexterity of a human.
Yes.
That have, in a sense,
remarkable facial expression as well.
Absolutely. Have facial expressions, can speak to you, can learn, and can take a whole lot of tasks. People always used to say, well, you want to make sure, that if you're really not sure about your career, you could always be a plumber because there's always going to need to be plumbers to clean the toilet, so if it blocks.
Yes.
It ain't necessarily so. And so we need to change our view about what that actually is going to mean to the concept of work, of income, of society. It's starting already in hospitality, where you get a little machine that will come and serve it. That's a little that's like R2D2 or whatever. What I'm talking about is a thing that looks like the wait staff. Comes up, asks for your order, whatever. And as long as you can plug it in at the end of the night, it doesn't cost you anything.
Potentially scary, isn't it? And I think you're right. We really haven't wrapped our heads around it yet. Some futurists might say, well, it's a great development, and will change the world in a very positive way. But you have to be a little bit cautious about it as well.
When some of the futurists who know a lot about this stuff, refer to the existential threat to mankind, you've got to listen to them. Because in the first instance, it's going to be really appealing. To have people do stuff you don't want to do, and it doesn't cost you anything other than buy the thing in the first place. You're not great. How productive can I be? And how goes that? And then it's almost like the boiled frog. 10 years down the track. What have we created? So I worry about that, and I think it's fascinating to see how humanity handles that, because we are on the cusp of the next revolution. We really are.
John, it's time for you to hit the home gym. Thank you very much for being our guest on Hearts and Minds. You've been very generous with your time.
Thank you so much.
All the best.
Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in to Hearts and Minds. If you enjoyed this episode, please take a moment to leave us a rating or share it with a friend. And don't forget to follow us and connect on social media for updates on all of our upcoming guests. I'm Alana Bray-White, and I look forward to you joining us for our next episode.